All right, this is section 4.2 of your MathLinks 8 textbook. This is on converting fractions to decimals and percents, converting decimals to fractions and percents, and converting percents to fractions and decimals. So we're interchangeably being able to take one of those three um, styles and converting it to the other two. So the first question, question 4 that we had said convert this fraction to both a decimal and a percent. So for A, there are two ways we could approach this question. 1 over 250. What's the easiest way to convert that fraction to a decimal? Yeah, I'm going to take my calculator and I'm going to take the numerator and divide it by the denominator. And every time that will work. I will get 0.004. That's how we change any fraction to a decimal. Alternatively, and I'm going to show both ways. Alternatively, if you can come up with an equivalent fraction that either has 10 or 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 or 100,000 or any base 10 denominator, you can read that fraction as it's written and then be able to translate it directly to a decimal. So here I'm going to use the denominator of 1,000 and I'm going to make an equivalent fraction because I know that 250 times 4 is 1,000 of 4 over 1,000, which when I read it as 4 thousandths, I can then write it as 4 thousandths because it's tenths, hundredths, thousandths. So two ways you can convert that to a decimal is that way. And actually, the nice thing is when I look at this again and say, okay, what is this now? Because I also have to make it as a percent. Well, as a fraction, we've already determined that it's 4 over 1,000, and percentages are always out of 100. So what would the equivalent, I guess we're going to call it a fraction, even though you can't have decimals in your fraction, really. What would the equivalent fraction be that I'll use as a percent? What did I divide 1,000 by to get 100? 10. So if I divide both by 10, I end up with 0.4 out of 100, which I'm going to use as 0.4%. Okay. So technically, that entire string of thought is what I want you to be capable of doing. I want you to be able to change that fraction to a decimal through division, change that decimal to an equivalent fraction, and work from there. In your second question, B, 81 over 200. If I change it to a decimal, the easiest way to do it is just say, well, 81 divided by 200 is 0.405, which of course is equivalent to 405 thousandths. This is really the important part, knowing that this is 405 thousandths, and this is also read the exact same way as 405 thousandths. Once you have it written that way, in order to get it into a fraction out of 100, you would divide by 10, and you get 40.5 out of 100, which is 40.5%. Now you can write it that way, or if you want to be fancy, you could write it as 40.5%. Both are the correct answer. And finally, C, 7 over 5. Just take your calculator and go, what is 7 divided by 5, which is 1.4. This is where it gets tricky, because when I change this to a fraction, I have to read it as 1 and 4 tenths, which is 1 and 4 tenths as a fraction. Now, when we try and make percentages, we don't want to deal with mixed fractions. It's much easier to deal with it as an improper fraction. So 1 and 4 tenths as an equivalent fraction is 14 tenths. And as an equivalent fraction out of 100, because we're making percentages, it would be 140 out of 100, which our final answer is therefore 140%. Question 6 says convert each decimal to a percent and a fraction. So it's a little bit different. Now we're going backwards. If I take this first one in A and I read it properly, I'm going to read it as 72 10,000ths. Right? That's how I would read it. And I know that because this is the tenths, the hundredths, the thousandths, the 10,000ths. So it's 72 10,000ths, which means as a fraction, it's 72 10,000ths. Now, once I have it written as a fraction, because I read it with place value, my denominator is already base 10, so it's real easy for me to create an equivalent fraction that's base 10. I'm going to divide both numerator and denominator. I have to knock off 2 zeros, so I want to divide it by 100, because 100 has 2 zeros. And when I do that, I get 0.72 out of 100, which is equal to 0.72%. Okay, less than 1%. For B, 0.548. Again, using my place value, that's tenths, hundredths, thousandths. So I have 548 thousandths, which is what as a percentage? What do I have to divide both numerator and denominator to create that equivalent fraction? 10. And when I divide 548 by 10, I get 54.8, which then allows me to create 54.8%. And finally, for C, the one that probably a lot of you didn't get right, but we'll see. How do I read this number? I would read it as 3 and 45 hundredths, which is 3 and 45 hundredths. So step one is just converting that decimal number into a mixed fraction. And from there, I don't want to work with mixed fractions. I want to work with improper fractions. So I'm just going to make a quick conversion from a mixed fraction to an improper. Remember, if back in grade 6, you probably learned that 100 times 3 is 300, plus 45 is 345 over 100. And once you have that, you have 345 hundredths, which is 345%. Question 8 says, this time we're given the percentage and it asks us to change it to a decimal and a fraction. So for A, 248%, what do you think the first thing I'm going to change it to is? Fraction, because it's really easy. Because it's a percent, because we have a percent, that means automatically I can make it as a fraction out of 100, which is 248 out of 100. Now, obviously, if I was testing your ability to change it to a fraction, I wouldn't want you to keep it like that. I'd probably want you to change it to what type of fraction? A mixed fraction, yeah, which would be this. These are both acceptable. And actually, if it was a test and I said change it to a fraction, what do you think I'm probably going to ask you? What kind of fraction? In lowest terms, right? So both are divisible by 2, which would be 24 over 50, divisible by 2 again, which is 12 over 25. So in lowest terms, if I divide both by 4, it would be that, okay? But which of these, the yellow, the green, or the blue, of those three colors, which one is the most appropriate to then change it into a decimal? How many say yellow is the most appropriate? How many say green is the most appropriate? How many say blue is the most appropriate? The answer is actually the green is, and here's why. Somebody read to me the green number. What does it say? 2 and 48 hundredths, right? When I read it, automatically I'm able to write it as a decimal. If I read 248 hundredths, it's very confusing because if I think of my decimal places, tenths, hundredths, if I put 248 hundredths in here, it kind of makes sense, but it doesn't quite work the same way as reading it as 2 and 48 hundredths. So the answer is the green is the easiest way. So if you have a fraction and you want to change it to a decimal, it's much easier to change a mixed fraction to a decimal than an improper. With B, I have 0.56%. And as you do these questions, you have to make sure you really understand that that is less than 1%. So as a fraction that we don't normally use, 0.56%, again, because it's a percent, it's going to be out of 100, so 0.56 out of 100. But because I have that decimal in there, I need to multiply it by a number that will get rid of the decimal. How many times do I need to move the decimal place? Twice. So what do I want to multiply it by? 100. If I multiply both by 100, I create an equivalent fraction of 56 over 10,000. And once I have that, that's the fraction part, not in lowest terms, but it's the fraction part. And if I put some lines down here, 56 10,000ths is the number, so tenths, hundredths, thousandths, 10,000ths is right there. 56 has to end there, not start there. And in order to keep the 56 out in the 10,000ths position, add a couple of insignificant, or significant zeros, excuse me. and I'll get 0.0056. And finally, your last question in this particular one is 75.75%. 75.75%, which we're going to change right off the bat to 75.75%. I'm just going to change that fraction of a percent to a decimal, which is the same thing. And once we have that, it's 75.75 out of 100 because we're not dealing with percents, which is 7,575 out of 10,000. Right? We're multiplying it by 100 because we want to move the decimal 2 places. 7,575 10,000ths is 7,575 tenths, hundredths, thousandths, 10,000ths, 10,000. Question 10. I'm a big fan of this table. I like to use them quite a bit in our testing. It says copy and complete the following table. So 230% as a fraction, because it's a percent, is 230 out of 100. Now, I don't like what the textbook did there. It left it as improper. I would much rather you put it as mixed. And in fact, I would much rather you express it as a mixed fraction in lowest terms. But for 230%, I would like all of those expressed. Question. We'll do the same one we did before. The blue, the green, or the yellow. Which one is the most appropriate fraction to use to change it to a decimal? How many say green? How many say blue? How many say yellow? Yellow is the answer. Well, let's look at both. If I do it in green, 2 3/100ths would be the green, versus the red, which is 2 3/10ths. Why is 2 3/10ths better than 2 3/100ths? Because it has an insignificant zero that's not necessary to define the number. Right. So your best one is using this one here. Your next question is 0.38%. So as a fraction, this is the bad version of the fraction, right? We don't want to have decimals in our fractions. So I have to multiply both by 100 because I want to move the decimal 2 places. So once I multiply by 100, I get 38. Once I multiply 100 by 100, I get 10,000. So 38 10,000ths, which in lowest terms is 19 5,000ths, because both are divisible by 2. And once we have that, 38 10,000ths will be the fraction we use to write it as a decimal. Because when I say 38 10,000ths, tenths, hundredths, thousandths, 10,000ths, 38 goes there. So 0.0038 is 38 10,000ths. And finally, 19.9% is 19.9 out of 100, which is 199 out of 1,000 as an equivalent fraction. Unfortunately for us, that's lowest terms, I think. And once we have that, 199 thousandths is tenths, hundredths, thousandths, 199 thousandths. Question 11 says, express the shaded portion of each diagram as a fraction, decimal, or percent. So we're going to take this shape as being 100% of whatever object it is we have. Gas tank, cup of milk, whatever it happens to be. So as a fraction, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There are 25 squares there. 5 by 5 makes 25 squares. And of the 25 squares, that's our denominator, we have 5, 10, 15, 17 shaded in. So expressing this picture as a fraction, it's 17/25ths. Do I have to use division to create the percent and the decimal, or can I use a different method? Multiply both by, create an equivalent fraction. By multiplying by 4, I'm going to get 34/68 out of 100, which is great because now that I have that, I can now make my decimal, which is 68 hundredths. And I could also make my percent, which is 68%. Now, if you couldn't do that, you could have gone from here directly to the decimal through division, right? If I went 17 divided by 25, I would have got my decimal, and then from there I could have got my percent. The next one, there are 6 by 4. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 by 1, 2, 3, 4. 6 by 4 makes how many squares? 24 squares. Why is it doing this? There we go. 24 squares. And I have 9 out of 24. Now here, I was able to multiply by 4 to get 100, but 24 doesn't lend itself well to multiplication or division to get you down to a base 10 denominator. So I'm just going to use straight up division. 9 divided by 24. That's going to get me 0.375, which is equal to 375 thousandths, right? Which allows me to then say it's equal to how many hundredths? Anybody? I knew I lost you. 375 thousandths is equal to how many hundredths? 37.5 hundredths, and that's important because that allows me to write my percent. Question 12, if we look at this one, here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We have 25 out of 25 shaded in, and we have 8 out of 25 shaded in. So when we're looking at more than one full shaded shape, we're looking at more than 100% of the shape is shaded in. We have 100% here, but we have a little bit more than that over here. So when I add those together, I end up with 33 over 25. That's the fraction that this picture is expressing. It's 33 over 25, or as a mixed fraction, or 1 and 8/25. Okay. So both of those answers are correct for what is that picture expressing. And once I have that, if I use division, I'm not going to use division. I'm going to use equivalent fractions. Why am I going to choose equivalent fractions? Because my denominator is 25, which allows me quite conveniently to write it like that. And I multiply by 4. I get 120, 132, which right away, I know my answer, therefore, is 132%. Not only is 100% of that square shaded in, but we got a little bit of extra here in the back, and therefore it's 132%. Now, this one is the fraction I'm going to use to create my decimal from. Okay, or this one. Which one's the better one? What's 132 hundredths as a mixed fraction? 1 and 32 hundredths, which is 1 and 32 hundredths. If I did it over here, I have 1 and, the only thing I have to figure out is what is 8/25 as a decimal. If I took my 8 divided by 25, it's still going to give me that decimal 32. And I would have been able to use that fraction as well if I didn't have it. Okay. My last one, I have 20 out of 20 here. I have an additional 20 over 20 here. And I have additional 7 over 20 here. So when I add those three shapes together, what would I get? 47/20, which is equal to 2 and 7/20 as a fraction. Which, if I take this 47/20 and make it into an equivalent fraction out of 100, I'd have to multiply 47 by what number to make that equivalent fraction? 5, right? So 47 multiplied by your 5 is 235, which is 235%. And if I take this and just straight up use division, because I just need to create a decimal, 47 divided by 20 will tell me the decimal of 2.35.